Should we get started? Should we go now?
Sure, can do.
Very good. So welcome everybody. My name's Richard Jenkins and I'm a director at Elizabeth Norman International. We recruit in the data and insight space across geographies, particularly Asia, obviously. And during the kind of COVID crisis that we're still going through here, I was talking to Jan about what was happening there and basically trying to see what kind of market we might have, if any, in a few months after we were locked down. So we started talking in about April time, and we kind of got on to kind of talking about how things had changed in China, and it became clear that they'd adapted to a new way of life, and not only had businesses had started to reopen, but they were facing new challenges in attracting and retaining customers. And that's kind of how we ended up with the idea of this webinar. So with China further ahead in their recovery, we thought it'd be a good idea to hold a webinar which could hopefully give you all an idea of what might lie ahead in terms of trends, and also what might be similar culturally and also what might not be as well. I've known Jan for 6 years, something like that. Since Added Value, which is now Cantor Consulting, obviously, Insight, and now his consultancy, White Caviar. He's lived in China since 2004 and obviously has a lot of experience in the market firsthand and regularly consults with international business on China market strategies. He'll do a much better job of introducing himself, so I'll let him do that in a minute. In the meantime, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please just do ask them in the chat box at the bottom. We're going to cover 5 key themes, which is flattening the curve, what's the new normal, China now, skills and techniques, and the impact of working remotely. We want to make the webinar as useful as possible. So if you have any questions, however specific they might be to your interest, then please do ask. And don't be afraid to ask things that are maybe a little bit social or political as well. I'm going to hand over to Jan now, but if you pop questions in the chat box rather than Q&A, that would help. And also, I can unmute people if you want to speak, if your question is particularly long. So just pop that in there and say, you know, I'd like to ask a question at the end or something like that. And we can sort that out as well. It can be anything from, I'm just interested to know what the future may hold, to we have clients or projects in China and we want to understand the landscape a bit more for international businesses versus local business, something like that. So, so I'm going to hand over to Jan now and we'll get going.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction and welcome to everybody as well. I just want to very quickly build on what Richard was saying. Eventually, I mean, I think we're a little bit more of a smaller group, so that makes it a bit more intimate despite being online. So at any point in time, I mean, raise your questions. We can make this dynamic, and that's usually where we've had a good vibrancy. We'll also make this available for everybody attending, so no need to write everything down, or even for the questions, we'll come back to you as well with the answers afterwards as a further amendment to this. So as Richard said, I've actually been in China for quite a long time, and we started White Caviar as an insight-driven brand and innovation consultancy here based in Shanghai. So my background is actually one of molecular biology, and equally I've studied some virology, so it brings a little bit of a different dimension and a different take to it. And so it's the quest of, in science, we start with experiments and we don't know what's coming out. And that's also what I look at in the aim to understand the markets and understanding the consumers. Is really being open-minded, and that's what we put in our work. That's what we do with our clients. What we've also been doing here, actually, since the beginning of the year, is we've been acting as a bit of the social, cultural / political expert on some of the matters related to COVID here in China for the Benelux Chamber of Commerce. And so we've had very good response to being able to share that perspectives with the companies and the businesses here. What we're going to talk about, and Richard very briefly mentioned that, is I think it's worth, I mean, no matter which stage of the cycle we're at in different markets, I think it's worth to really very briefly look at flattening the curve here in China. there's been, at least for us, significant and recognizable changes in that process that I think is good to understand. To then move into what is some of the new normal, what is some of the things that we believe are here to stay. I mean, how is it impacting our lives? And then from an industry perspective, looking at a few of the sectors that are hard hit, but other sectors doing well. And then eventually, I mean, to tie it up with, I mean, what Richard and what Lisbeth Norman is doing actually is looking a little bit at the human resource side of things. I mean, what is the skills, the techniques that really have started to emerge? I mean, and what's, for instance, also the impact of working remotely. Which for a long time has been a hot topic in the news is China. Everybody's working remotely. So how is that working? And hopefully we can give some perspective on that. On the challenges that came along with that, but also more importantly, how businesses nowadays are actually looking at their commercial space management and strategies. And so that's what I'll hope to take you through. Raise questions as they come on, and we'll look forward. So I just wanted to bring up this map here. As I was talking to Richard just before, the red indicates obviously the severity, and we see in Europe there's still a number of areas of outbreaks. US, we all know, has been hard hit, but interestingly, when you look at that map, you see that China and some of the Asian countries really have started to become normalized again, and so that's a starting point. That's what we use to look at and to step into the topic of today. And one of the things that I like to look at, and it's a quote from João de Evangel de Almeida, which says a lot of the things that actually we have experienced here firsthand, but also afterwards, also everybody, I think, can agree with the fact that diseases are a great tool to magnify social trends and tensions. If we look at how each of the markets have been reacting differently, if we look at some of the international tensions, racial tensions that have come along with the way that people were looking at the outbreak, I think it's a very valid quote, and I hope that inspires the rest of the session that we can have today.
What do you think the key economic and social and political drivers have been behind the success of controlling the virus and getting back to normal?
Yeah, so if we look a little bit at the big picture of that, so if we look at how Chinese people have flattened the curve, and I also put there Chinese people, it's not all been about the government. We see that there's been different policies and guidelines and changes that were constantly evolving that really have helped us through. If we look at it from January till where we are now, actually, we've seen that upon the identification of COVID-19, very rapidly, there was the issue of the order of war, which basically here means the whole nation, all resources, military and other, get mobilized to trigger the response mechanisms. So the quarantines, general policies were adjusted, social life and businesses basically came to a standstill and were impacted. In February, then we really saw that the response pattern really got established. I mean, there was much more clarity coming through. Quarantine measures were adjusted with the necessary policy changes. So, for instance, policies around working from home. People were coming out of Chinese New Year. What is going to happen with businesses? And so we've seen this gradual change of policies as the nation was moving forward and as the nation needed to move forward out of the quarantines. Measures around social distancing. We've seen during that time also a very strong rise, and we'll come back to that later, of contactless economy and interactions. In March, it really was about some of the businesses that had already restarted. I mean, not everybody could work from home. And so it really was the focus then of reopening the economy. And therefore, a lot of the measures that were coming in place was about workplace safety and hygiene measures. What happens in social environments, in public spaces, public transportation, and so on. And so we've seen that these measures and policies then specifically with that eye of opening up have been constantly again been updated, and always have been in relationship to where the nation was in terms of infected cases and so on. So for instance, when schools reopened in June here in Shanghai, schools had already reopened in some other areas in China earlier on. Businesses, for instance, Wuhan officially reopened after 76 days of closure, but that didn't mean that everything got reopened at the same time. So there was always a bit of a gradual process. And even some of these measures are still in place today. And so from April onwards, it really, the focus was on controlling any of the incoming cases, whether it was a small outbreak, whether there was people returning to China. So that really was a key focus, to make sure that the efforts that were put in were not put in jeopardy. The social distancing and everything was still in place, and in a way is still there, although only in, I would say, some of the social places, some of the public transportation and so on. And there's still that level of national assertiveness, what I've put here. So we still see, even though we're September now, and there's been hardly any new cases in Shanghai, people, when we go to the school to pick up the kids, we're still wearing masks. When you go in public transportation, we still wear the masks. You step into a Didi or an Uber, mask wearing still is here. And so proper hygiene as well. And it shows that we continue with these measures just proactively in that sense. But what we've also seen next to these policy changes was very strong cultural norms. And I think it's easy to look and say, well, you had all these policies in place and people had no choice and you had to oblige and follow them. Culturally, though, it's important to understand that here in Northeast Asian markets, it's a culture where people are more willing to control their personal desires as compared to Western countries. What that means is that, they put common good in front of personal freedom and personal benefit. We've seen that also, that that resulted in higher levels, if not even higher levels of social compliance with social distancing and preventative measures, as compared to what we've sometimes seen in Western markets. So there was very high levels of compliance. And then the third aspect that was interesting here socially is that people in Northeast Asia, we were easier to adapt to that level of social distancing. And I give the example here is, like, for us, actually a handshake or a kiss on the cheek when you meet each other and so on. We had no problems to not do that. And it is not because we actually say this is, we have a judgment on those rituals, but because they're less practiced here by default. Yeah, was that when you have business meetings and interactions, you not necessarily had the same closeness to people as what you would have in Western markets. And this is maybe a minor component, but it's small elements that actually helped culturally for the nation to move forward. And then actually, from very rapidly, we've seen this where people were on social media and they say, oh, I'm seeing my friend off because they're traveling to Wuhan and so on. So there's been very, very high levels of national solidarity. And that's also traditional and characteristics for the Chinese culture here. So there's been this proactive element in it, which was even in our situation, because I felt bad initially that we didn't have face masks. But we couldn't get any because priority was given to Wuhan and to Hubei province, because that's where the need was the highest. And because we were then, confined in our home environment and we avoided going out. We've seen that then gradually, again, when masks became available, the supplies were there and eventually it made us equally at ease. But there's also been this reactive solidarity where we've seen that based on what people buy now, based on the behavior that people now adopt, is that the support for local businesses in response to, for instance, some of the ethnic racism that we've seen has popped up in certain markets, the blame that has been put on China, some of the trade conflicts and so on. And so that made that around these uncertainties and for instance, even things like targeting Chinese students overseas and other aspects, that there's a reactive solidarity now towards some of the local brands and behaviors. And so, yes?
I was going to say, so do you think it's been a genuine cultural reaction, or do you think it's been a reaction to the kind of regulations put out by the government?
I would say it's both. And one thing that actually, when talking with the Chinese people here as well around that topic, is that one of the big differences, for instance, with SARS was that with SARS, actually the Chinese government was trying to cover up. It was like, I mean, don't spread false rumors when there was the assumptions being coming out in the media of what happened at the time in the south of China. Now, actually, I mean, there's been much more openness on that, but also, I mean, from a general public, because the death toll was quite severe at SARS, and so the Chinese people also have learned about that, and that I think part of the reaction and what was driving the compliance also was the fact that people knew that if we wouldn't take good hygiene measures, if we wouldn't wear a mask, and if we wouldn't have that social distancing, things would get worse. And that's then exactly linking it back to that spirit. Whereas it's okay, let's just stay in for a week or for 2 weeks and see the improvements, because otherwise it's not going to improve. And it's the combination of the policies that were put in place, and you've seen that evolution of these policies. They had a very clear focus at each stage in that epidemic timeline, but also, I mean, that nationwide solidarity through what they've learned and what we've learned before.
Yeah, and we've got
Now,
another quick question, which is, being on the ground in China, what examples of completely new product services have you seen that have really responded excellently to the COVID crisis? We're probably going to cover that in a bit more detail in a few slides' time, so we'll get onto that and then we'll readdress that, if that's okay.
yeah, well, I suggest if we park that a little bit and we'll readdress that. I mean, if you ask me, one of the very big forces behind some of the changes in technology was contactless. And remember that principle, contactless. You will see that will come through later on, whether it is medical, whether it is healthcare, whether it is just my daily transactions and interactions with, in terms of payments and other things. And I'll give some examples of that as well when we get there. Now, but what we've seen in China, I mean, and from my perspective, then also, I mean, has not necessarily been as easy, yeah, to apply in other markets, because there's always like, well, what's the best approach? And I don't think there is one ultimate ideal approach. I think every country, and that's important, is the responses and the reactions always need to be looked at within a cultural context. And so what we've seen actually from a Chinese perspective globally is that there was a little bit of lack of preparedness. It was, at the time, it's a China issue, it's not ours. And so the response was delayed. I mean, we've seen regional diversity. Look at Europe. Italy was on its own in the beginning. Yeah, until people really started to see the severity of it. That's where gradually across Europe we've seen responses were being and resources being mobilized. We here had a lot of preparedness in terms of infrastructure and so on. So that also is not necessarily up to the same level as what we've seen in China here as what we have in Europe. Legislative barriers. So, I mean, obviously China is one big country that makes it easier to sometimes, I mean, make sure that everything gets implemented in one, with one voice. Trade barriers, sanctions. I mean, things where we've seen a very rapid shift of production of PPE that was not a problem here versus, I mean, in Europe. I mean, can we do this with the regulations and so on? There was a lot more time sometimes for some of these steps to take place. Eventually we got there, and a lot of these have also come in place, but the speed with which has been very different, and particularly also around sporting events. Large sporting events here is still not on the radar. I mean, the Chinese Soccer League has started. Some smaller events are gradually starting. But like what we've seen in Europe still was like, what do we do with soccer? Yeah? I mean, people from Italy were going to France to watch football games because they were cancelled in their home markets. These things didn't happen here. Yeah? So we didn't have these quiet spreader events as we've seen in other regions. Now, coming then out of this a little bit in terms of what is the new normal, how has the behavior actually changed? What we see is that in China, change means progress. Yeah? And so people look for new opportunities, sometimes more than trying to revert to the old normal. Yeah? And that is also quite striking. And even for me, it is, I'm used to this now, but people might not necessarily want to go back to the old, but yeah, or the situation before, but they look at, okay, this is a new dynamic now, and they look for the new opportunities. And we'll again see some examples on that later on as well when we look about resources, when we look about employment. Yeah, but coming out of this, and I'm not going to go through the fine print here on this page, but I just want to highlight some of the bigger trends here. Is the advanced and augmented lives, what I mentioned here, is under siege of stigmas and private interests. I mean, China actually might come out ahead. There's been the aspect of ethnic racism, what I've mentioned, but that's impacting how, I mean, local governments will have to deal with this and national governments have to deal with this, but it's impacting in terms of which brands and everything becomes more appealing. And that makes that from a consumer goods point of view, brands will need to take the necessary sensitivity to these local nuances that now come at play. Yeah, because people might actually look back at some international reactions when they make a choice between what kind of brand they might buy, domestic or international. So it's a new dynamic. Digital livelihoods is a reality. I mean, China was already digitally quite ahead, and in a way it felt that we were prepared for this, even though it wasn't purposely prepared. But I mean, the digital revolution that has taken place here in the last decennium really made that we work actually quite ahead. I've had in previous discussions as well, we for instance, we can say that actually I have hardly been to a supermarket in the past 3 years, because we order online, it gets delivered to the door. And so that's all the digital process and the e-commerce and digital transactions, all is so different here. And that really helped us to get through in a very efficient way. And coming to those groceries, for instance, in the beginning, they were delivered to the door, they ring the doorbell, and you have the interaction with the person, they get handed over. As we got through the epidemic and we were quarantined, and then there was the curfew that came into place certain nights, is that, I mean, gradually then these delivery boys, they rang the doorbell, they left the groceries and they left, to eventually the point where the groceries were delivered to the security gate of the living compounds, and then the security guard would call you, it's like your shopping has arrived, and then we actually went to pick it up. So really minimizing the contact, minimizing, for instance, people who are not living in certain compounds or certain areas, not to enter that area, but leave then the deliveries outside. And so we've really, even on that aspect, seen the change, but it didn't impact accessibility to these things. So digital life, really very important, and contactless, you'll see more examples of that later. There's also been the resilience and the creativity. I think one thing that we've seen here in China is the speed of reaction and the speed of mobilizing resources. When restaurants and pubs and bars and hotels were closed, obviously that leaves a pool of low-wage employees without a job. And so the e-commerce delivery services, they saw that they were lacking capacity. And so there's been very swift resource allocation, resource sharing. So the swiftness and the agility of thinking to make sure that things kept going has been very strong, and that's certainly going to have a lasting impact. New retail models, I mean, because shopping malls were closed and everybody talked about working from home, but shopping malls were closed, and literally it had a very big impact. But the digitalization here really enabled the salespeople in store, the retailers, to still make up for some of the losses that they've had. And then we've also seen, as part of that, the retail models, is that social selling became something that is very important and is going to stay. Where really what happens in social selling is that the sales staff, they have the contacts of their customers on their social media. And so they started to push out messages, they started to do live streaming, really with their own social circle, to get rid of the stock or to sell their goods. And then Community 2.0, it's basically new policies that we see coming in place. I mean, particularly around wet markets, and that has already been implemented. So everybody was talking about the wet market in Wuhan, where possibly these things might have emerged. What we've seen here in China, thousands of kilometers away, is actually the wet market that was near us also has changed. It's completely demolished. But the farmers and everybody who was selling there actually now have got a new venue, where hygiene and all of these things can be taken better care of. That already in a time span of a few months. Yeah.
Got a quick
Other things.
question on the. Oh, sorry, there's another one as well. I'll read this one up first. Regarding the ethnic racism we've seen in the West towards Chinese students and people, are you seeing any reduction over there in the desire of Chinese families to have their children study abroad?
That will certainly have an impact. People are reconsidering, and it is a combination of facts. Over the past few years, actually, and this is a moment for some of the Chinese universities. Chinese universities have also improved their educational standards and their status globally. So there is on the one hand now the question is like, well, I mean, why not go to a Chinese university? That's one. The second thing is one, and that's the very big impact, is parents are now looking at where is it safe for my child to go and study. And I know from good sources, for instance, that some universities in the UK are actually going as far as to pay for chartered flights to get the students who were enrolled to get them to come over to the UK. So there is the UK universities and universities elsewhere are feeling an impact of this, and they're trying to come up with what is the right plan to really make sure that those that were enrolled, that they're not affected. That's what I know from for instance, from some universities in the UK. Australia is so again. There's other elements that lead to a reconsideration of study in Australia. Same for the US. For the US, I think there's about 1,000 student visas that have been revoked. That normally is a number that is a lot higher than there was in the past. So there is going to be a little bit of a reshuffling in terms of where Chinese students are going to go in the future. Having said that, I mean, overseas studies and that international experience is something that will not fade away. That is still going to be very important here for Chinese families, that their children are going to get that exposure as part of their educational experiences eventually. We'll just need to see how the shift of countries is going to take place and which markets are going to be highest affected.
And the other question that we had was on social selling in China. How prevalent was that beforehand, and how has that changed? And is it parallel with what the UK and the US do in terms of influencers and things like that?
No, actually here there's a lot more possible, and to give you an example, so live streaming was already happening before. It is just with the outbreak that live streaming has seen a significant boom. A lot more people were picking up on live streaming, but it also makes now that actually in the past 2 weeks there's been more word around the regulations that are coming up on that. And that is something typical also for China. So there's a lot of things that happen here that are initially not so regulated, yeah, but then gradually start to become regulated as they grow bigger, or as we see that we need to start to control and police. In the Western markets, very often it is regulated first, and then you can go ahead. So it's again one of these differences in terms of how people go about it. Now, the interesting thing is in the e-commerce models is that we've seen the social selling, as I said earlier, the sales staff, they started to tap into their own network of friends or contacts they had to sell directly. And I'll give you the anecdote where I was on the phone with a US clothing brand, and was asking how they got through this period. And they say, well, we've got our materials and our apparel on Tmall, and we're hoping that we will eventually sell something. Whilst I was on the call with that client, at the same time, I had the sales staff from my Chinese brands that I sometimes buy from. They were actually vlogging and promoting their goods. And so the striking difference of that personal engagement that has come into place. Now, and that really stretched beyond the traditional live streamers, because farmers who couldn't go to the wet market because wet markets were closed, but had their crops and vegetables that were ready for harvesting, they took to live streaming. So we've seen farmers and people who actually might normally not go on to live streaming doing this. The older population, for instance, um, tapping into these channels, social selling channels, where it is like, I know somebody who can get us that amount of fresh fish. Anyone else wants this? And then they buy it in larger quantities. And so on the one hand, they get very fresh product, but on the other hand, they also reduce the amount of contact and journeys to the stores, because they pick it up directly from the main from the main source. And even to the point in the other extreme, where we've seen that company CEOs, yeah, of large state-owned companies even as well, they equally have taken to live streaming, leading to very big volumes of sales and so on. So that is a new audience that we've seen, even though temporarily, but I mean, they actually solidarized with the staff they had. And equally for instance, another segment was celebrities and models. We personally have friends in those medias, but I mean, television shows could not be recorded. Yeah? And so all of a sudden, these people were without a job. And so they then started to look at live streaming and teaming up with certain brands and thereby look at how can we generate some income. And we still have people who on the one hand have a modeling business, but who during COVID started to sell dried beef and are still selling dried beef now that their business is resuming again, because it's an additional source of income. So we've really seen social selling, live streaming and e-commerce taking on very different dimensions and new forms in this period. Yeah. Another aspect here, I mean, data and science for society, that's also been a key driver, not only of rapidly flattening the curve, but also of the progression that we've seen. AI is going to be here to stay. I mean, we've seen, and I really also for myself, I've asked myself that question, is like, on the one hand, we've seen AI and robotics as taking away jobs. On the other hand, here we've seen that they have fulfilled life-saving roles. And so I think we all need to relook at how we live jointly together with this in harmony with technology. And what we've seen now, for instance, is that this is on the backdrop, you see a food delivery robot that we see in some restaurants, that we see in some office buildings and office spaces. But even shopping malls now use AI to sort of like make their marketing materials much more efficient and their marketing investments much more efficient to reach particular audiences. So AI now starts to find many more applications in different sources. Big data at the service of people, that's one of the big things here. People really not had a problem with sharing their data, which means that, I mean, contact tracing and other things was immediately possible. We have the health code, and I'm just going to show you eventually. So I can go onto my social network, I can click on the health app, and then it will hopefully still say that I've got a green code. Let me just, yeah. So I've got a green code, and that's all based on answering a couple of questions. That's all based on my mobility profile, but it allows me to go back into business buildings. It allows me to go and visit clients. It allowed me to go back on public transportation. And what it does is, my green code, if I'm in the shopping street, I knew everybody else had a green code. And so it's that safety feeling. And it's like, that's why people didn't immediately have a problem in sharing their personal data. And likewise, it didn't give the details that maybe were too sensitive. It's just the big details and the big outlines that really enabled these things to take place. The conscious crisis management and really that cooperation that we've seen, and then, I mean, the resourcefulness that I've mentioned earlier as well. So these are really some of the things that have been driving a lot of the successes. And we've seen that, I mean, eventually for everybody coming out of this, what we've seen is that socially, there's going to be a recalibration of some of the social norms. Culturally, we've seen that growth of digital entertainment, AR experiences, online tutoring. We cannot go around it. It's going to be here to stay. It might fall back a little bit versus the peak, but there's learnings that people have taken from that here, and it's resulted in business opportunities, and people are not going to let that go by. Economically, I mean, what we've seen, and I gave you that example earlier, is Chinese brands and businesses, they are rebounding more quickly than some of the international brands. Now, economically, there is going to be, there is a very strong focus from the government also on the graduates and the low wage earners, because these have been very hard hit. And then politically, I mean, there's all the new policies related to health management, environment, trading, and resourcing. So there's a lot of things from a policy point of view that are also taking place. Shanghai at the moment is already working out on a 5-year healthcare plan to better deal with these situations whenever there is a future outbreak. So there's significant changes of integration of data, smart technology in the whole healthcare system to avoid this from happening in the future, but also to be even more swift and faster in terms of response.
And here, obviously, we've had kind of differing messages as time has gone on, that it's not safe and then it is safe, which could be seen to mean that compliance is dwindling. Do you think that the government there has been seen to, the strategy has been seen as one to keep citizens safe, rather than a mixture of kind of reopening the economy and public health, and has that kind of maintained that compliance as well?
Yeah. The main focus here has been on safety, and you've seen that probably also a little bit on some of the earlier slides, where the way that the policies were updated was all as a function of the scientific data that was available, and also on the personal data in terms of mobility patterns and so on. So safety really has been first. And then what's been happening is that after the quarantine, after first 2 weeks, and in a way, China in that sense might have been lucky a little bit, is that it was Chinese New Year, so businesses were closed. They kept them closed for another week, so that meant that by default everybody was staying in place for already 2 weeks. And then they extended that a little bit. Gradually businesses were coming online, and so this is where then the Chinese government, the way that they've looked at it, is which industries and which sectors were most needed to get the country back up and running. And so you see that, for instance, in Wuhan and Hubei province is very important here for automotive. Automotive is a very big part of China's GDP and industry. And so there was a lot of push to reopen, but they didn't reopen before safety measures and everything was in place. And so they've really been opening up as a function of industry and sectors that were most needed, but always been doing that in a way that safety was guaranteed. We've also seen it actually quite interesting as we talk about that, also in terms of how the economic stimulus program has been. We've seen in Europe had been talking about this massive stimulus package that was made available. There was hardly any talk about stimulus package in the first month and a half here in China. And that already also says it was health and safety first. And then what the Chinese government then did is they then looked at which sectors have been hardest hit and where do we need to then spend the stimulus package that we did. So it's almost like, I mean, a way where the stimulus was allocated based on the severity of the impact and on the importance as part of the total GDP. So China now, and this is some images of how China is now, and in a way there's been a lot of reactions towards some of the parties that were happening in Wuhan. That is not happening everywhere still, but I mean, the one thing that we cannot forget is actually it started in January and we're now in September. And we went to the movies last week and a few weeks ago, as the theaters were reopened, and there's still very little traffic. It's still not completely normalized, but it shows that only after 6 months can we go back to a movie theater. People in Western countries, they are crying out, let us go back to restaurants, let us go back to this and that. And so some of the reactions that we've seen here towards the behavior in China nowadays, we cannot forget the amount of time that people have been staying at home here, the amount of time that people have really taken a lot of precautions in terms of wearing masks, having high compliances with these safety measures. And so that is something that is sitting behind these images as well. And you still see, I mean, a lot of people wearing masks nowadays. But weddings were equally cancelled. Below in the middle, you see a small event. Small scale is happening. Soccer. This is in Wuhan, where very limited people in stadiums. But I mean, it's resuming. But with every challenge in China, here comes an opportunity. And that's also, even in the word crisis in Chinese, it's made up of 2 characters. One is crisis, the other one is opportunity. And it lives in that spirit. So with every challenge comes an opportunity. And so we've seen single-digit GDP growth. In August, we've seen 11.6% rise in exports, and export is going to be a big part again of the growth. But also, I mean, services are really going to play an important part of this. Trade fairs are happening again. A lot of them are being digitalized because there's very few people who can travel in the country, and so there's a lot of digital matchmaking between companies and industries and sectors that's going on here. So a lot of push to really keep that international connection and business drive going forward. But it's been really at a different pace, be it social, cultural, economic, or political. We've seen that on a social level. I mean, social gatherings have resumed, but are not fully there yet. I mean, nightlife, if you look at the big clubs, it's far from what it was. Schools have reopened, but under very strict rules. Even for the National Day holiday, which is 1 week holiday coming up in October. I mean, people, if you plan to travel, you need to be back in Shanghai for 2 weeks before your child can go back to school. So that basically means that nobody will be traveling out of Shanghai. Culturally, domestic travel has picked up, but not there yet. Yet we know, for instance, that nightlife and street fairs, in the past, they were banned. They have been reinstated because they were equally a drive to get the economy back up and running. So we see some of these old initiatives getting brought to a new life. Economically, shopping malls, if I'm fair, we go in there, the traffic is still less. We were in a shop also a few weeks ago, and I think the salesperson was surprised that we were buying something because for her, she's had very, very quiet months. And so the traffic is still lower than what it used to be. And then in terms of political focus now, I mean, we see that the government overall is focusing back on the big 5-year planning that they have laid out before COVID actually hit the country. So politically, I mean, things are normalizing again with the addition of new policies that are coming in place. So there is that optimism.
I'm sorry, I've just got a quick question. It is, you said disease magnifies social and racial tensions. However, Hong Kongese are prohibited to publicly protest due to the COVID-19 measures. Do you think that COVID-19 instead magnifies and depresses social and racial tensions in China?
I wouldn't say so. And obviously, I mean, that's a very political question. But I always say the second opening up in China was the social media, was the internet. If you look at, I mean, and equally that's a bit of a controversy that is around that. But the story that came out in Wuhan with the doctor, actually, that broke on social media. If social media wouldn't have been there, I mean, the Chinese government was made aware, but the whole process would have been a lot slower. Recently now as well, we've seen that, and it's disconnected maybe, but I'm just giving these as a few examples to see how social media is actually helping in a number of aspects. Is that the delivery boys, food delivery, they actually were under so much time pressure that they were jumping red lights. Sometimes they were speeding and other things. And so this broke out also on social media, that how come, I mean, these guys are under so much pressure that now all of a sudden the food delivery services, they're actually going to relook at the algorithms, the time windows that they can allocate and so on. So that is changing. So it is not about suppressing and things like that. I mean, it's giving opportunities, but where we need to look at is that the priority still is there on health, and that's the main thing. What is mattering most for people, and I'm not sure whether that fully would answer that question. But social media here has enabled a lot. And it is not whether this is in China or not, but in any country, and that's where maybe it becomes a little bit political. Once you start on social media to rally against the government, there's always going to be a clampdown, whether you are in China, whether you are in the US, whether you are in Europe, in any market. And so that's always a perspective that we cannot forget. And so that in a way is also impacting a little bit some of the tensions that we see there and how people are responding, or some of the news that is being reported. So and equally then we see that there is a bit of a reluctance even in Hong Kong in terms of people getting tested and so on. In contrast, in Beijing, when there was a little outbreak in Beijing, I mean, compounds were shut down. I mean, I had friends of us who were said like, now it's our turn to go and get tested. And so there was hardly any objections on that. And so it is all about where different messages, where different tensions are coming together. And I think it's about unraveling these and looking at where is what really going to help and where is what really contributing in terms of moving forward. Yeah. Going back to a little bit of that optimism that we've seen here, but I mean, there's still a couple of, and I'm just going to go a little bit quicker here, is that with that optimism that we've seen that there was in China, even that optimism was not, we've grown now and we're back up to normal. Things were still not fully up to normal. And even up until today, actually, it's also still not fully normal. But this gives you a little bit of an idea. So the daily trips, for instance, in May was only 50% of a year ago. Tourist attractions only up to 30% of maximum capacity and only 80% opened and things like that. So things are not all fully 100% yet. Now, what we see though for the October holiday is that we cannot book train tickets anymore to go to another city because they're all booked out. So domestic travel definitely is going to see a very big impact, positive impact again versus the May holiday here with the October holiday. So industries will gradually and over time all rebound. But this is actually quite interesting to see how, despite the positivity that comes out, I mean, there's still a little bit of a slower process that sits behind that. Yeah. And that's where we see, like, I mean, certain industries here, if we look at it on the left side, it's the industries that have been impacted most negative. On the right side, what has been impacted most positive and has been growing. The timeline is still undefined, but interestingly, for instance, you see that if you look at retail, that has been heavily impacted, but online retail and contactless has really been growing. The live entertainment has come to a standstill, but online entertainment, content generation has been really big. International travel, cruise lines and airlines really hard hit. Even I think it was the first time in 1 or 2 decades that the Chinese airlines were not making profit. Yeah, so hard hit, but domestic travel actually has kept a little bit of a momentum. Interestingly, on automotive, actually, automotive has been hard hit, but we've seen, and that's still a mixed message that is out there. We've seen that a number of people have actually purchased. I mean, a car purchase is not that hard hit if we look at it from a new car buyer perspective, because a lot of people now have bought a second car or have bought a first car because it is a safe way to get to the office, so it avoids taking public transportation. And so we've seen a little bit of an uptick in new energy vehicles here in China. Quite interestingly then, compared to what was expected overall for the industry. And then everything IT related, AI, technology, smart tech, really seen a positive impact. So who takes the heat? I mean, 3 big categories: international travel, tourism, as I called out, sports and entertainment, and retail. The interesting thing with travel and tourism is it's not just the airlines and the cruise lines and so on. It is the local economies that equally, the subsectors that are equally impacted by tourism that are really struggling with that. Same thing for the sports events. We had large international sports events that were all cancelled here in China. That's the preparations that local businesses have taken have all been impacted. And in retail, we've talked a bit about earlier on as well. Who takes a leap? I mean, healthcare and biosciences, digital content creation, and AI and smart technology. And you've seen earlier, I mean, on the QR code that I've shown you, the green code, one of the applications, health care. In China, when you have a disease or when you're not feeling well, you need to go to hospital. And you will all know these stories that there's long queuing lines, and hospitals is not the same as in the West, and so on. And so digital doctors access to health apps really has surged almost with, I mean, some apps surged with 800 to 1,000% of usage, active usage, because people had access to digital advice during the COVID period. So that avoided people having to go to hospital for like minor symptoms or to get an initial consultation. Digital content creation really, I mean, from a cultural point of view, movies being made available directly online, new content being generated by musea, but equally from a learning point of view, learning topics, a lot has happened in those spaces. And this is just some examples here. So, I mean, AI and robotics has really played a very big role in terms of flattening the curve and tackling the disease. So in the makeshift hospital in Wuhan that was globally on television in terms of the record pace with which it had been constructed, they spent, I think, 1 extra day to put in the IT in place, and that made that cloud computing was enabling a minimum of medical staff in these hospitals. They were communicating with specialists in Wuhan's main hospital, with specialists in Beijing and Shanghai to help with the diagnosis and set the treatment. And so it kept the number of staff in these critical areas in hospitals really to a minimum. Yeah? Robots distributing medicine and so on. Contactless connections between patient and doctors even. Yeah? The health apps that I talked about earlier here on the top left. Remote electrocardiograph monitors, so actually reducing contacts, intelligent stethoscopes, technologies that were in part, you could say, under development, but have been accelerated here that we've seen. In terms of content, online karaoke, who saw that young people were staying at home now much more and basically were doing that. A yoga teacher who actually contracted COVID herself was amazed by the fact that she had more than 14 million views of her instructive videos. Museums, as I said, and even the nightclubs. And I think in Europe, we've also seen part of that, but some of the big nightclubs here basically got their DJs to live stream from the studio, and then people having being able to enjoy the music at home, commenting on the social media, so communicating and chatting away with others. So completely different experiences, but it's out of the box thinking really at the early days in the outbreak. And then, I mean, examples of AI and smart technologies. So with the green code, basically that being able to enter living compounds, so opening the gates, application of drones in disinfecting rural villages, difficult to reach areas. Alibaba actually here also supporting the development of an AI-enabled algorithm that sped up the analysis and the diagnostics. So you have 96% accuracy in 20 seconds to make a diagnosis. So you can imagine if you're dealing with large rates of infections, these things really have helped. And then smart helmets, and you could say, well, this is cybersecurity and futuristic. But these helmets really enable police on the streets to identify individuals that could pose a risk from an infection and identify them, screen them much faster and much more efficiently than before. And so these are definitely going to be technologies that are going to stay and that we'll see much more of in the future. Brands then also...
Sorry. From the consumer perspective, how do you think COVID has changed the Chinese customer desires and ideals? What are the new things that post-COVID Chinese consumers are looking for in products that they may not have cared about previously? I don't know whether you're going to cover that slightly in this slide anyway, but...
I think what they would be looking at is the value. What's it worth for me? We've seen, and I've seen this from quantitative work that we've done globally, where there's a lot more conscious spending going on. Obviously, the high net worth individuals, they can have still significant spending power, but for other people, I mean, they're spending more consciously. They inform themselves more. The content needs to be right. The quality needs to be guaranteed to make make the payment and make the transaction. So that is one thing that is going to be very important. And as part of that, young people here in China, we already see the Gen Zers and so they start to look more at some local brands in particular categories like beauty care, sometimes also in fashion and so on. So we do see a little bit of a shift. And so for brands, it's important to get the right content and maintain the quality on that. This was a slide here where actually it gives a little bit of an overview of how, even from a communication point of view, how brands actually connected with the market. It was connecting first before COVID, everybody was communicating around their product. Then it was all about messages around supporting Wuhan, to then focusing and shifting that message during the transition and opening up time to a story that focused on the things that mattered in life, is your health, your safety. And these things really had a big impact at that time. And BMW has been doing well in its social media on that, which is the example here behind on the screen. And then it's normalizing now. So whereas it's still going a little bit into the promotional area, we see more and more communication coming back around products. Yeah, I'm going to go a little bit faster here because I'm wary of time. I'm flexible, Richard, if need be, but what we've seen in terms of opportunities, so really maintaining brand development has been key. Withdrawing from the market, we've seen very few brands do it, but we've seen a lot of brands go into sleeping mode, and that also has been not a good idea. Because Chinese brands have stayed active. Smart product and service innovation, thinking about your logistics, thinking about your purchase journeys. Where can you make it easier for consumers to interact with you, to get access and to go into transactions? New content, because we're communicating and interacting differently, that makes that stories need to be delivered differently. On social media and on a small screen, people don't scroll down 10 pages of information. So the push of information relevancy needs to be looked at carefully. And then contactless from a retail and supply point of view, and I've given a couple of examples already on that. In terms of skills and techniques on where we've seen an impact, is that in the first quarter, the digital readiness really has been instrumental for brands to survive. Whether the digital readiness of getting their people to go live streaming and so on. And Nike has been a great example, who's suffered less than their competitors like Adidas and Li-Ning, because they were digitally ready. They had digital communities that were quite well developed and so on. And so they had good resource on that. A lot of local brands actually started to look within their circle of staff on terms of, and pushing them to go live streaming as well. And so digital readiness, very big point in the first quarter. Then in quarter two, we've seen it's really been more around innovation and some further business adjustments, the logistics, the supply chain, service adjustments, and so on. To now in quarter three, actually really further looking at that resource and supply optimization to push for financial gains, to help with the financial recovery of some of the businesses. So that's where some of the big lines that we've seen. There has been millions of job losses here.
Sorry, there'll be two questions here because one is about job losses as well. So
yeah.
One is if you could unpack a little bit more, why do you think Chinese consumers are more interested in local brands for now? And kind of from me, do you think that will affect international brands' abilities to penetrate the market like they once have?
Yeah, I think the interest is there in part out of solidarity, because they know businesses have been hard hit. So that's a dynamic that we'll see now, but that's a dynamic that will not continue to go through and push through. But the more important dynamic for brands to be aware about and companies to be aware about is the fact that over the years, Chinese brands have stepped up quite significantly in terms of their quality, but also their functionality. If I look back at the early days in 2004, everybody was sitting in front of me talking about Chinese brands. Is like, well, who buys Chinese brands? because they lacked credibility, they lacked quality. When I came back in 2016 and I looked at that same question, the first brands that people mentioned was Chinese brands. And so Chinese brands have really seen a very big step change in terms of quality, in terms of design, and not just in consumer goods, but generally also in car design, in technology design, and so on. China has stepped up quite significantly. And then in certain categories like skincare, personal care, there has always been that belief that people here, Chinese brands know my skin best, they know my needs best. We've got different health and so on. And so we've got a different body, and thereby there's been part also that believe that Chinese brands might deliver better against some of the emerging needs that are coming out of this. So that's and that is the dynamic that is, I would say, more worrying, that will continue after the normalization as well. It's really the relevancy and the significant change that local brands have undertaken in the past decade to really better address the needs of the Chinese consumer. And you've just seen already some of these applications in smart technology and so on, is that the reason why that works here is because there's always functions that are being added to it that have a purpose, that actually make my life easier. And that's what they feel, is that local brands sometimes understand the needs better than international brands. So it's very important to listen to your local teams here, to get that advice that lays that bare, because it's a very big market, it's a very important market for a lot of brands. And so you don't want to miss out on misinterpreting the needs because you try to push a global product into a market where maybe the relevancy might be lower. Yeah, and in terms of employment and job losses, that's always a little bit more difficult to get the exact numbers. So these are numbers from June, July. They're still quite accurate. And you see that, I mean, in the urban, the big cities, about 6% losses. I mean, urban youth a little bit harder hit than the general population, and then particularly the rural workers. That's where we've seen a very big hit. And so also in international companies, what we've seen is that sometimes the leadership has been pulled back to the head office, to the mother country. We've seen sometimes a replacement with local staff now. The mid-level has seemed to be quite stable because these people were in a job and they try to keep that job now at the moment. So they're less out on the outlook for something new. But it's really been the fresh graduates and the low-income workers that have been hard hit. Now, and it was interesting because I asked myself the question as well, based on some of the imagery that I saw from the US. In the US, unemployment has gone high up, even in Europe. And I literally asked the question, is this something that has gone by unnoticed here? That, I mean, people are queuing, people are relying on the support they get from the government. And so what happened here with even with the low income workers, so a lot of the migrant workers has gone back to their villages, to their hometowns. They have always had something back that they could fall back on. There's been a minimum of social security here, but they've always had a house and a roof above their head. We haven't seen evictions as what we've seen in the US. And so people have proactively also looked at new opportunities. So a job loss here under COVID meant that there was maybe another opportunity they could take. And we had, for instance, a house worker here who had a monthly income which wasn't high, but she said, look, I mean, actually my husband is now doing the food delivery and I can actually earn more if I support him in that business. And so they've given up their low income job to find another low income job that was a little bit more paying. And so they've always been on the outlook of where is other opportunities. And that is something that if the social security system is not as developed here as what it is in the West, that also has pushed people always to look for those opportunities. And remember what I said, the word crisis in Chinese, it's crisis as well as opportunity. And that's still in that spirit here that we've seen. What we have seen on a governing level, I mean, there's obviously VAT relief, I mean, special financial platforms that have come into play, making it easier, low-cost lending. There's been a number of economic measures for businesses to really help them get through. Even though if I still see, if I go a little bit here in the suburbs and cycle around, then I still see a lot of small businesses actually having closed, very low visitors, or just changing altogether into a new business, into a new store that's been established. From a consumer point of view, there's been a lot of stimulus. For instance, for cars, there's been stimulus checks that have been given out in some municipalities, in some provinces. Other provinces have followed suit. We've had big shopping festivals, so really offering discounts that have tried to get consumers and people back out to buying products, to buying goods or appliances. So on the consumer side, there's been a lot of stimulus in that sense as well. And then because the migrant workers and the fresh graduates were hardest hit, that's really where the government in their plan has given a lot of emphasis. There's a lot of priorities on finding and creating jobs that actually can really get these people back in the business so that they can resume work as normal. And that's where the government now is focusing on. Yeah. But in reality, so what we still see, I mean, there's still some salary cuts that have taken place. I mean, people equally have seen flexible rules in terms of encouraging them to take their annual leave before Q3, Q4. There's been a bit of localization of talent, as I said, international staff being pulled back, being replaced by local staff, or even the question of Hong Kong, for instance. I mean, Hong Kong has been a center also for some regional headquarters. I've heard personal stories of clients of mine where the global head or the regional head here has been moved back. The general management of China taking their place, and so the offices in Hong Kong being absorbed in the total China business because of the situation, because of the restrictions of travel, because of the uncertainty sometimes of the people individually who've expressed this, that they didn't feel safe here in China because of the outbreak for personal reasons, that some people also have moved back, and that's causing a shift into that transition of staff.
Is that still a general trend? Yeah, I'm sorry. Is that a general trend that more people are leaving China, or is it still kind of a good place to work or move to, or will it be moving forward?
It is still a good place to work and move to. It is about the cultural understanding. So there's been what we have seen though since February, there's been a number of people who've moved back. We saw a little bit of that already taking place last summer, but I mean, it's accelerated specifically during COVID. And we see that particularly, and it's tangible, for instance, also in the housing market. The landlords are more willing to go into negotiations on the rental prices and so on. And we see a lot of properties remains empty, commercial property as well as private property. And so that's an indicator for us as well in terms of how a lot of these international roles have started to shift a little bit. Yeah, and as I said, I mean, this U.S. company whom have withdrawn their regional head here and actually delegated that function and that role to the managing director of China is one example where you see more local talent taking on some of these senior roles as well. Yeah. So some of the emerging roles is really in the digital fields. I mean, the question is for businesses, how digitally ready are you? Is particularly roles and functions in proximity logistics, where there's been a very big uptake, and that's going to remain. The new role specifically in terms of like cloud beauty advisors, redistribution of other job roles to really accommodate for where do we find the business is happening internally as well in a number of local businesses that we see. And then data managers. Data is driving, and it's equally for our industry, I would say, it become a competitor where a lot of the e-commerce platforms, they have a lot of transactional data, and actually data management is becoming equally important as it's providing a new source of information for businesses. Now, having said that, we've also seen that despite all that, large number of new business registrations, many in wholesale and retail sectors, a little bit less in rental and business service sectors, but and then less even in industries like manufacturing, construction, and so on. The interesting thing is really what I mentioned earlier, that phenomena of live streaming, as a lot of young people have seen live streaming as a way for them to be, for instance, in the business of selling tea, local produced tea, local produced vegetable and fruits, or helping farmers to sell these aspects, or really be creative in what they've been doing. And so that's what we've seen. And an example here is that in the past, for instance, a flower farmer actually only getting 20 orders each day, now because of live streaming getting about 500 orders a day. And so that shows the resilience, that shows that, I mean, the initiative that some of the local people, even some that I wasn't expecting would take it, that it has turned out positive for a number of people. And so when I had clients in Europe asking me, so what should I do? I've got a small business, should I reach out to my customers? Would they think I'm pushing too much on them? People here have taken a leap of faith, and they've gone for it, and it's really been paying off for a number of these people. So equally when people were not necessarily as digitally savvy. Yeah. Some of these farmers have equally become an internet celebrity in a way, and so it's really changed the way that they've been looking at it. And so young people promoting rural lifestyle and rural content, making that this whole dynamic and the appeal of living in the smaller cities or in the countryside is gradually changing or leading to new, be it opportunities in tourism for the economy and so on. Now, the impact on working remotely, and you see this picture here of this person sitting on her sofa, lots of pillows behind it. Working remotely here has not always been ideal. I've known that for some of my staff as well, who sometimes stayed later in the office because the environment in the office was better than at home, and so all of a sudden that falls away. But the shift really has been working from home, from ensuring employee safety to now really rethinking workplace strategy. Face-to-face will always be preferred still. I still prefer going to clients and so on, but I've got a number of clients who say, like, look, let's just do it on Zoom and so on, and we still have good engagements eventually. Another example here in the backdrop, this guy in his bedroom, the windowsill is just wide enough to place a screen and his keyboard. That's his home office. And so the challenge really has been in the fact that in many cases still the living spaces were smaller, sometimes shared spaces with a number of young people sharing an apartment. Equally, the multi-generation families where I'm living together with my parents and my grandparents, and you can imagine that the grandparents walking around in the house and say, like, why do you have to spend so much time on this computer here? You spend the whole day on the computer, on that screen. Whereas I had the former colleague saying is, well, I'm working. And so the generations not really having an understanding of what working today means in some businesses. And so that's created very different challenges than, for instance, in Western homes, where sometimes you could dedicate a separate room for that, where maybe the dining room was a little bit bigger, or where each child or each parent could fall back on a separate bedroom. We didn't have that here. We equally had kids taking online education from the office space, and so it's a different arrangement, but it's workable. And so what's happening now is that what we see is that a lot of businesses are accelerating their strategy reviews on the commercial needs of the workspace. So if businesses were around 70, 80% occupied, if they needed to create space, they might not have necessarily moved, because now there's only 50% occupancy. So that means social distancing had become easier. Working from home was encouraged, but I mean, it really is a difference whether you've got a business of 5 people, 30 people, or 300 people, in terms of what that means from a space requirement if you need to take social distancing into account. And so people started to look at shifts, people started to look at alternative arrangements, 2 days in the office, 3 days at home, and then your colleague can take your place. And so very dynamic. And so it's become a top priority now for a lot of the companies. The ones where we see it's going to have a least lasting effect is everything where IP is becoming or has been very important. So sometimes banks, financial institutions, very difficult to work from home or could continue to work from home. Gaming industry, very sensitive sectors, or certain IT sectors where you're dealing with evolutionary technology. This is industries where then we have seen that, I mean, the sooner they could resume face-to-face was better because of the IP and security. And so that's how some of that is shifting now. And so we've seen that sometimes with the reduction of office space, physical office space, some companies have moved to smaller locations. With the savings they have taken, they've actually reinvested some of these savings to optimize and increase the equipment that their staff could use at home. So bigger screen at home, investing in better laptops and things like that. So they've reinvested actually in the employees to make that possible. And today we see in a lot of companies that they have become more flexible around some of the engagements in terms of working hours, in terms of flexibility. It's like you're coming not in the office today, it's not a problem as long as everything happens. So we see a shift of mindset, and certainly elements of that are going to stay stronger depending on the industries that we see. I know I've ran a little bit over. We've had a number of questions already, but if there's any more questions, Richard, happy to address these still.
Yeah, there's a couple. So one is actually follows on from what we were talking about just beforehand, which was around the amount of data that the Chinese government has on you. So it says, with personal data widely shared and a plethora of commercial apps and easily acquired by the police, do you feel more or less safe?
We actually here feel more safe. And it's a very interesting question, and it really comes down to how the East and West is looking at this. The amount of data that the government and the police might have on me, and I'll give you that example. As I showed you my green code, that green code is actually made based on a couple of very simple questions of where have I been? So on a city level, have I been to another city? Or have I been in an area in the city that actually is more contagious than another one? What it doesn't do, it shares that data, and it had access to that data, but it doesn't have access to what I really did about what I did there. It doesn't have access to the information that I was discussing there. And so that's the big difference. So if I put in my flight number, for instance, in the very early days, that was one thing that one could do with the train and the flights, particularly for the people that were returning to the big cities early on. So I could put in my flight number or my train number, and I could get a notice then that says, like, you better get tested because somebody was contagious, or you're safe because there was no infections of any passenger on that train. It doesn't tell me the names of those people, but it tells me that I was safe in that moment. And so there is a difference between the level of data that is being used here for these things. And actually, you could argue again on that. When the Chinese mobile companies put themselves together and merged the data, and in one of my earlier presentations, I have a very nice slide of this, how the use of that data has been used for the control of the spread, how in the early days that really facilitated, where you saw one person from Wuhan going to another city, and now how that data sharing enabled the local government then to take the right actions, is that these mobile operators, they did that in agreement with the government on the purpose of the necessary data protection. So they would give the data that actually was enabling the local governments to set the right policies to make sure that they could contain an outbreak if there was a risk, or if they could indicate that you were in a safe area and could open up. So in that sense, Chinese people have been very open with that. And I must say that we were getting daily updates 2 to 3 times a day with the number of cases. We knew exactly, we didn't know the name of these cases, but we knew exactly these cases, where they were coming from, what was the condition of these cases. They were hospitalized, they were in recovery, they were, I mean, there was mortality cases. So we had very detailed update of data. And whereas that was at a high level at first, it became much more granular. So as more countries started to get infected, we got international data. As then people started to come back, we got the number of cases that returned and from where these people were returning. But it was at a generic level. It was at a level that it was informing us versus infringing on privacy. Now, obviously, you need to share your data beforehand, but it really, what it did is it helped people to feel reassured. It helped us to monitor the outbreak. And I mean, for us, it was like, oh, there's no new cases in Shanghai, or in that district, there's some cases, so we're still safe here. And so it really was comforting for us in that sense. And so from a patient's point of view, then, I mean, what would you want? The data there was used, for instance, in Wuhan, in these hospitals, to really help with the treatment and the diagnosis. And so that is what's been very tangible for us. From how the data was used for us and with us in the pandemic here. Now, there's a second element to that question in terms of the supervision and the suspicion on the monitoring and the control. And Richard, and you'll know in the discussion we had just before the webinar, I was reading that in the US, I mean, now there is a law that's coming into place that's preventing the use of facial scan technology on the surveillance and on street cameras and so on. And so that is obviously, I mean, in relation to the protection of privacy. And that is all good because it protects you, your data, your personal opinion in that sense. Here in China, the cameras are often positioned in Western media as it's surveillance, it's control. From a Chinese perspective, they look at it different and they say, well, actually, it keeps us safe. And I gave you the anecdotes earlier. And in the past, I mean, a good 10 years ago, there was a lot of incidents happening on the street where elderly people sometimes were faking an accident to actually get money off you. These things are not happening anymore. There's far less pickpocketing. Why? Because there is cameras. And so the cameras here really have given a safety feeling. And again, it is one where it is about, there is a ton of data. Who is going to analyze all that data? But what it has done is that in case of accidents, the police is able to fall back on that and actually make the right judgment calls, because otherwise it's his word against my word. And so here people look at that in the sense of safety. And as I go to the school or as I go here in my neighborhood, I probably pass a lot more cameras that I'm actually aware about, but it doesn't impact me. And so I think it is all about the perceptions. The Chinese here look at it as it's helping keeping us safe and increasing the safety feeling on the street. It's equally these cameras, and there's images been circulating on Western media where through the aid of cameras with drones, people have then been able to say, like, you're not wearing your mask, please wear your mask. And then you could say, well, that's really infringing on my privacy because it says the person in the blue jumper, can you please wear your mask? That's then again with a health aspect to it. But overall, these things here are actually being looked at in a much more positive sense as what people in the West might think.
And we've got a question on how do you think the COVID crisis has changed perception of the foreigners and the West for Chinese people?
So repeat, say that again.
How do you think the COVID crisis has changed perceptions of foreigners and the West for Chinese people?
Um,
Perceptions changed of
I
Westerners.
think there's still, I mean, there's been a little bit of a perception that maybe for foreigners they were less welcome, but actually, I mean, that sentiment hasn't changed dramatically here in China. So it's still, as long as everybody obeys by the rules and things like that, actually, within China we see very little change. Now, the way that the Chinese look at the West is a little bit with disbelief. And the disbelief, again, I mean, I'm able to put that into perspective because I live that on a daily basis, but it is a disbelief where they don't understand the sometimes lower levels of compliance. They don't understand the debates that are going on about a mask that costs, I mean, I can buy a mask here for 1 kwai, yeah, which is a few cents, a few euro cents, or a few pence. And so they don't understand why this has been so politicized and why sometimes that has been so difficult. Because for them, actually, here it's a humanitarian question rather than a political and ideological question. And so, what the Chinese do is they put health first. The Chinese people are willing to compromise on personal freedom if it is giving a health benefit, and so that's where we see a lot of disbelief. But it doesn't result in ethnic racism as what we've seen in the West. What we have seen, though, and what we have heard from friends of us who were, for instance, in Germany or in other countries in Europe, is that they were looked at with eyes that were a little bit sort of like skeptical. Are you infected? Or are you not infected? So they were actually happy to come back because they did feel that there was a changing sentiment in Europe around the ethnicity. But here in China, I mean, I must say I don't immediately see, particularly not in the big cities here, is I don't see people distanciating themselves from me. I don't get served differently than what I was before. So in that sense, that level of tolerance actually hasn't changed eventually. Coming back, I mean, just because there was something that fell in afterwards when we talk about the cameras and the surveillance. The facial recognition technology here is that I can buy a drink, and I can very happily do that. I can buy a drink using a facial scan, and I don't have to touch the vending machine. So if you think about that, and that's the further build on this contactless, um, we pay with our phone. We've got a QR code. We scan it. I mean, we can pay. I can request my invoice with this. I can order my meal in the restaurant, all using my phone. So that what that means is I'm not touching menus that have been handled by other people. I'm not dealing with bar money anymore because it's all digital. And now I can basically scan my face when I buy a drink from the vending machine. So I hardly have to touch the vending machine anymore because I can give the order on my phone as well. That's the product, get a facial scan, and I've paid. If you think about what that does moving forward, is it's reduced all these contact points. Like for instance, if you go to Africa, you're running around with money in your pockets that God knows where it's been. But it's a reality, and these are cases of or possible sources of infections that through contactless we are actually have been able to eliminate. And so with facial scan, that's going to go further here. I don't know where the development is going to take us, but that's going to go quite far. But what people sometimes forget is that when I'm using my iPhone, I mean, Apple also scans my face. It's the first thing I have to do when I set up my phone is my face gets scanned. So what happens with that data? And it's about asking the different question. We look at what's happening here and we can approach this with a necessary level of skepticism, but we also need to have that same level of skepticism with where what we see is happening in the Western markets. And here people have that trust because, as I said, I mean, it's not impacting their daily behavior, their daily transactions. It's business is actually being enhanced by the technological developments that we see here versus before. And that's very important to remember is to we always need to look at things in a cultural context, and so security cameras. I mean, Chinese parents looking at international schools where there's no cameras in the schools, they say, well, what's going to happen if something happens here? I mean, how can you see what's been causing it? How can you see what really happened because you got no cameras? So it's a very different perspective, and for me also that was eye-opening to hear local people look at these things sometimes through a very different lens than what we see in the Western media or what we see in Western cultures because of privacy legislation and other ways of using and working with technology.
I've probably just got one last question, unless there's anything else that's burning. And that was around the insight briefs that you've been seeing. The question was, what has been the impact on insight and strategy briefs that you have seen in comparison to before the COVID crisis?
Yeah, so within our industry, actually, there's been a lot less qualitative work coming forward. It's been very quiet and still is relatively quiet. Eventually, we are getting more briefs coming back in, so the activity is going up. What did happen though is most clients, they really stopped a lot of the ad hoc, a lot of the customized pieces of research they were doing. Local businesses or local clients actually haven't done that to the same extent, but things are starting to pick up again in the industry. What has happened, and that's what I mentioned earlier as well, is that, I mean, people have been relying much more on big data, alternative data sources to get initial impressions. But it is important to understand that that is not all. So we still need a brain to get into the motivational mindsets of people, to get into the motivational drivers and sentiment versus the only the transactional. And so generally it's still quiet, but slowly we see more briefs coming in. Interestingly, though, as well, we've had a couple of clients that we've worked with that have grown their business during COVID. So not all businesses have equally been impacted, and those clients then particularly, they have kept up their normal level of engagement with the market and the industry.
Very good, very good. I think that's it. We've run over by about half an hour, so.
But I hope at least the discussions for everybody have been fruitful, have been interesting. If anyone has questions afterwards, either I would say route them through you, Richard, or they can reach out to us as well. But it's been a pleasure to have this discussion and the variety of topics that have been brought up. So really enjoyed it.
We have just got actually one last question. Is there any opportunity for foreign companies to be involved in big data in China? Or was that a closed loop?
I'm not saying no. I think definitely there can, also because of the capabilities again that we bring. And for instance also aspects of security and all that we cannot forget, because we think everything here is an open net. We see that the discussions around data protection are starting to become a little bit more active. They're starting to bubble up a little bit more, so that's definitely going to change. And that's where Western companies definitely have an edge at the moment in terms of how to deal with these systems when data protection comes into place. Data management, data analysis, and data usage definitely still has opportunities here for overseas or international businesses and companies.
Good. If anyone else has any other questions that come to them afterwards, if you could send them over to me, richard@elizabethnorman.com, and I will forward them on to Jan and see if we can get you an answer. Your details from today's webinar won't be saved, so the only communications you'll get are to do with this webinar. If you want to sign up, then you can sign up on the website or LinkedIn or whatever that might be, but you can sign up to the newsletter that way. But I'm only going to send anything to do with the webinar, so the recording and things like that. So your data is kept separate from our systems as well.
Yeah. Good.
So yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Jan. It was really, really good. Hopefully see you soon.
It was a pleasure, and thank you everybody for staying with us and the good questions that were put forward. So much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.